Greetings, students! We ended our last video with the question, whence does the hobo's authority derive? What are the ties that bind the hobos together and allow them to form a coherent group with a specific culture? Moreover, wherefrom do they garner that peculiar quality of mystery and power, which typically hangs about the devotees of strange gods and cultivators of mystical purity? For the answer to this, I'd like to turn to a specific hobo, whose life story we have briefly described on this channel before. The man is Robert Monroe, who was ejected from the mainstream of American life by a facial burn that disfigured him in his 20th year. The hospital stay this entailed prevented him from pursuing the coursework for the degree that he was enrolled to study, and he spent the remaining year riding the rails before returning to school. Luckily for us, from his brief tour in that other world of the hobo, he translated certain insights gained by the nature of that world to we sedentary folk. Though he did not label this as the source of his insights, and may not even have made the conscious connection, I believe that an examination of his life's work does reveal something integral about the hobo experience, and specifically about the authority from which it derives. Mr. Monroe is perhaps best known today for founding the Monroe Institute, a company that develops techniques for achieving out-of-body experiences. The company has had particular success for such an outre endeavor, securing as clients the Central Intelligence Agency and the Intelligence and Security Command of the United States Army, as well as gracing the front page of the Wall Street Journal, among other publications. The foundation for this method in the Monroe Institute's methodology is a patented process known as Hemisync. The underlying theory can be found in U.S. patent numbers 3884218, 5213562, and 5356368. They make for fascinating reading, and I suspect that they form part of the real-life basis for the fiction of the Videodrome signal described in David Cronenberg's movie of that name. Perhaps I will ask the Popcorn Man about that. He has, by the way, been christened Orville Van Pop, in case you were curious. Anyhow, in any case, the fundamental technology of Hemisync is that it creates a regular audio loop of repeating rhythms at particular frequencies. The patent has built much on top of this, but the fundamental insight has broader applications. We see this clearly, and in a way appropriate to the historical timing of Robert Monroe's experiences, when we consider the phenomenon of highway hypnosis. This was first identified in the 1920s, where it was identified under the far less catchy name of road hypnotism. The insight was that drivers on the long haul often had extensive gaps in their memory. Investigating this led the researchers to discover that the drivers slipped into an altered state of consciousness, in which, essentially, their subconscious minds were doing the driving and not keeping any records. This was further expounded on in another paper at the time, entitled Sleeping with the Eyes Open. According to Wikipedia, there have been further speculations that hypnotic dissociation can occur under the auspices of driving. The concept of the monotonous, repetitive rhythms of the road creating the conditions necessary for hypnotic dissociation is interesting in light of Robert Monroe's work. What makes his work distinct, however, aside from the patina of electroencephalograms and the complexity of his binaural beats, is that unlike highway hypnosis, it is performed on a relaxed patient. There is no requirement to be present in the world and functioning in some complex way, as there is with driving. This makes unsurprising the difference in the dissociative states induced. While highway hypnosis creates a state wherein one loses track of time and records no memories, but otherwise attains merely a sense of heightened focus, the gateway process of Robert Monroe's Institute creates a fully realized psychic experience in which one has vivid impressions of the surrounding world, despite having one's organs of sense completely disengaged. Could it be that Robert Monroe's year-long tour as a hobo acquainted him just deeply enough with the ever-present rhythmic pounding of the train tracks that he realized on some subconscious level that this very phenomenon was the foundation for astral projection and a host of other magical pursuits? It seems likely to me. This is, after all, the one commonality amongst all hobos: the tracks. And the rhythmic pounding was not the only potentially illuminating aspect of their illicit travels either. Not only would these individuals ride in boxcars, which lacked the owl installation afforded to regular passenger cars, but they would ride exposed to the elements. This brings to mind Simeon Stylites, who lived 37 years on a small platform pillar exposed to the sun, wind, and rain. He is a fine exemplar of a general practice performed by monks seeking to cultivate spiritual power, and one the hobos practiced as a matter of course in the process of riding the rails. And so, the day-to-day hardships of the hobo had much to commend themselves to the cultivation of spiritual power. But there is a vacuum here. Without a cultural superstructure present to open the pathways to specific spirits or gods, with what spiritual entities was the hobo fated to traffic? And what forms did these take? I am reminded here of the biblical story of Lot. To briefly recap it, there were certain sinful cities that the God of the Old Testament despised. He sent 2 angels to the one good man in that city, and a mob formed demanding to have sex with the angels, who they perceived as beautiful wandering strangers. Lot offers his virgin daughters to the crowd instead, despite being a supposedly righteous man. The crowd rejects them and continues to demand the angels. In the end, God has Lot leave the city so that he can destroy it. A fascinating story, with clearly quite a few sticking points worthy of discussion. But the loudest and strangest parts of this story are not what intrigue me here. Instead, I would like to point out the way that the angels appear, as travelers for one, and as strangers for another. In short, they appeared anonymous. The vital function of anonymity is, of course, the alias. We mentioned in the previous video on the topic a certain hobo named Sam Lane, who, in being reported on, had some 6 names applied to him at the head of the article. Also mentioned was a man who went by what was obviously an alias, A Number 1, or, as one astute viewer points out, A No One. Another possible reading of that name. Very clever, Mr. Seymour, perhaps? Way to go. A+. There is an underlying assumption when we meet a person in the regular flow of life. They tell us a name, say Charles or Adrian, and by certain subtle cues, we expect that this name, or at least one very much like it, is written down on a piece of paper that they carry with them. A license for driving, or voting, or professional work, perhaps. Perhaps it is written on additional certificates as well in their home, and that records under this name are kept in the annals of the banks and hospitals and governmental offices of their city, state, and nation. In addition, we expect such things as their height, their age, their locations at which they've lived, to be matters of record that, though we might not look them up, we believe that they could be looked up by somebody, somewhere, somehow, if they should choose or have need to. However, such was not the case with the hobos. There was an article written in the Daily Dayton News in 1914 entitled "The Mark of the Tramp." In this, and repeated elsewhere in other publications, the method for a hobo choosing their name was described, foregoing a family name which may have linked them to a genealogy and hence the veins of bureaucracy in which they generally refused to flow. The hobos typically had a name that consisted of 2 or 3 details: a first name, an outstanding feature, and a location. This generated colorful names like Troy Whitey, Whiskey Pete, or the Missouri Kid. As if in parody of the regular convention, the hobo would be known by the first part of his name, while the entire name was typically reserved for monikers. And what, I can hear you asking, do you now mean by Monikers, Professor? Define the jargon before you hurl it at us, please. Well, there's no need to get testy, for defining the jargon is just what I was about to do. Moniker is a phrase that is used in two senses. The primary meaning is that it is simply a hobo's nom de road, i.e. Missouri Kid. However, its secondary meaning is a specific application of this name. From the B&O to the short line, from Reading to Pennsylvania, the boxcars were covered in a very particular type of graffiti, the moniker. This consisted of, usually, a name, a date, a letter, and an arrow. The proposed reading of this is, for example, Tennessee Slim was here on November 10th, 1927, and heading west. However, there is a peculiarity here. In the mass of historical examples collected by the Historical Graffiti Society, the majority simply have a name and a date, and many simply have two arrows pointing toward each other with the meaning of here, as in Kilroy was here, a bit of graffiti culture that has survived into the modern day. This makes the directional attribution particular to hobos. The obvious answer here is that hobos were more likely to be heading in some direction because of the trains. But I have found another route that makes me question this. We previously discussed the demonic glyphs encoded in an ancient book called the Key of Solomon. These, however, were not all of the infernal sigils known to antiquity. There was, in fact, a great proliferation of books with the names and seals of demons, all from different sources. In one of these books, known as the Grimorium Verum, there is a primary listing of 28 spirits, but supplemental to this, there are some 15 or so additional spirits. In this secondary listing, there is a spirit named Sustugriel. This is his glyph. A brakeman catching this image in a boxcar would be forgiven for thinking that Sustugriel caught the westbound on this very train. The similarity to the hobo glyph is quite striking. This is further interesting when you consider the provenance of the Grimorium Verum. While the emoji spirits are known to be descended from the Key of Solomon, as outlined in my video, The Demonic Truth Behind Emojis, the Verum spirits seem to have taken on a different route. Their history is more aligned with that of the pagan stream of thought that tumbled through the Middle Ages, preserved in the works of Iamblichus, Psellus, and Paracelsus. It is Paracelsus who describes for us the four elemental kingdoms associated with the elements, and attributes spirits to them. Fire in the east, earth in the south, air in the west, and water in the north. This aligns with the position of the sun in the zodiac at times of the year, namely that the sun is in Capricorn, an astrological constellation associated with Earth, when it is further south in the sky, i.e. at the start of winter. It is at the northernmost point at the start of summer in the sign of Cancer, and hence water. It is quote-unquote born in the east each day, associating that birth with spring and thereby Aries and fire, and it dies in the west in Libra, and then begins the first day of fall in the west. Layered on top of these elemental attributions, there are associations with types of spirits. Our contemporary culture has given us a rather literal view of what, for example, a watery spirit might look like, but I believe that the wateriness described by Paracelsus was originally intended to be something a little less clear-cut. In any case, I would point out that the West, air, with its associations of fall and the sunset, is the domain of the types of spirit that we know today as ghosts. This is particularly interesting when we read the description of Sustugriel in the Grimorium Verum, which states that he, quote, teaches the art of magic, he gives familiar spirits which can be used for all purposes, and he gives mandragores. Two things here connect the spirit with necromancy, or dealings with the dead. The first is that mandragores refers to an illicit rite wherein the sorcerer chops off the hand of a hanged man and makes of it a candle that confers invisibility for the purposes of robbery. The second is that this phrase, familiars. The viewers may be familiar with this concept, as in the cat of Sabrina the Teenage Witch. However, An examination of the Latin phrase leads us quickly to the dii familiares, or household gods, which include spirits known as the laures, which were generally known to be ancestor spirits. All this to say that reading the hobo meaning, that is the W meaning west when superimposed on the arrow, onto Sustugriel's glyph gives us meaningful insights and connections, which suggests that this 16th century Book of Demons and the walls of the B&O's boxcars are speaking the same language. Could it be that the arrow through the letter was not actually the direction a hobo was headed, but was instead actually a part of the hobo's name? Is there a true difference between the moniker and the demonic glyph? And is it possible that elemental spirits were using the anonymity of hobo culture to insinuate themselves en masse amongst this new class of unwitting meditators as though they were the angels of Lot? On our next installment, we will look more closely at the works of these old-timers performed amongst the hobos and what they taught to their mortal compatriots. Until then, may the pyramid's eye watch over us all.